Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most deliberate and systematic crimes. A crime not of violence, but of memory, not of murder, but of erasure. We're going to explore the stories of women who ruled kingdoms and empires, who commanded armies and shaped civilizations, who were powerful enough to be feared by those around them, and who were so threatening to the patriarchal order that their very existence had to be removed from history. Before we dive into these remarkable and heartbreaking stories, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you. I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed scrolling through your phone, perhaps thinking about all the history you learned in school and wondering what stories weren't told? Are you curled up on the couch, safe in the knowledge that your achievements, whatever they may be, won't be deliberately destroyed after you are gone? Tonight, I want you to appreciate that security, because as we step into the ancient world, we'll discover that being a powerful woman often meant that your legacy would be systematically dismantled. Your name chiseled from monuments, your face destroyed in artwork, your accomplishments attributed to men, and your very existence questioned by historians for millennia. Wherever you are, I want you to dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel through time to meet the queens, who were so powerful that history had to erase them. What if I told you that one of ancient Egypt's most successful pharaohs, who ruled for over 20 years, built magnificent monuments, and led prosperous trade expeditions, was so thoroughly erased from history that for 3,000 years scholars didn't even know she existed? What if I told you that China's only female emperor, who ruled for 15 years and expanded the empire significantly, was so vilified and written out of official histories that her accomplishments were attributed to men, and her reign was characterized as a period of chaos and moral decay? What if I told you that a British queen who was the legitimate heir to the English throne, who fought a civil war for her crown, was so systematically written out of history that the official list of English monarchs skips directly from her father to her son, as if she never existed? According to research by Professor Kara Cooney from UCLA, whose work on female pharaohs reveals the patterns of historical erasure, powerful women throughout history have faced not just opposition during their lifetimes, but systematic campaigns to remove them from collective memory after their deaths. This wasn't oversight. This was deliberate, calculated, and remarkably effective. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being so powerful, so successful, so threatening to the established order that after you die, those who come after you spend years, decades, even centuries, trying to make sure no one remembers you existed. Imagine having your name chiseled off every monument, your face destroyed in every statue and relief carving, your accomplishments reassigned to male relatives, your very legitimacy as a ruler questioned and denied. Tonight, I am going to take you inside this world of systematic historical erasure to meet real women whose power terrified the men around them so much that erasing these women from history became a priority. You'll discover the story of Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh whose nephew spent years erasing every trace of her 22-year reign. You'll meet Wu Zetian, China's only female emperor, whose accomplishments were buried under centuries of misogynistic historical revisionism. You'll learn about Empress Matilda, who fought for her throne and was written out of the list of English monarchs. You'll hear about Queen Nefertiti, whose mysterious disappearance from records may have been a deliberate erasure. And you'll understand why this matters today, how the patterns of historical erasure continue, and what we can learn from the women who were powerful enough to need erasing. Let me tell you about Hatshepsut, and I want you to remember her name because for 3,000 years most people didn't know it. Hatshepsut was a pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty, ruling from approximately 1479 to 1458 BCE. Not a queen consort, not a regent, but a pharaoh in her own right. One of ancient Egypt's most successful rulers, male or female. According to research by Dr. Kara Cooney, whose biography of Hatshepsut draws on extensive archaeological evidence and textual sources, Hatshepsut's reign was marked by prosperity, ambitious building projects, and successful trade expeditions. She built more monuments and statues than any pharaoh before her. She sent a famous expedition to the land of Punt that brought back myrrh trees, exotic animals, and valuable trade goods. She maintained peace and prosperity throughout Egypt for over 2 decades. By any measure, she was a successful pharaoh, and yet for 3,000 years, historians barely knew she existed. Here is what happened. Hatshepsut came to power as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, when her husband, Thutmose II, died. But instead of stepping aside when Thutmose III came of age, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, taking on all the titles, regalia, and even the traditional false beard of Egyptian kingship. She ruled successfully for over 20 years with Thutmose III in a subordinate role. According to Dr. Catherine Roerich from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, whose work on Hatshepsut's monuments documents her reign, Hatshepsut portrayed herself in male form in her official art, wearing the traditional male pharaoh's kilt and crown, because the concept of a female pharaoh was so foreign to Egyptian ideology that there was no artistic vocabulary for depicting one. But here is where the story becomes heartbreaking and infuriating. After Hatshepsut died and Thutmose III finally became sole ruler, at some point around the 20th year of his independent reign, a systematic campaign to erase Hatshepsut from history began. Her name was chiseled out of temple walls and monuments. Her statues were smashed, defaced, or buried. Her images were destroyed or altered to show Thutmose III or Thutmose III instead. Cartouches bearing her name were carved out and replaced. According to research by Professor Peter Dorman from the University of Chicago, whose analysis of the erasure patterns reveals the systematic nature of the campaign, this wasn't vandalism or accident. This was a deliberate, organized effort to remove Hatshepsut from the historical record. Why? The traditional explanation was that Thutmose III was angry at Hatshepsut for usurping power that should have been his, and after her death he took revenge by erasing her memory. But modern scholars, including Dr. Anne Macy Roth from New York University, whose research on royal succession suggests more complex motives, now believe the erasure may have been more about legitimacy than revenge. By the time Thutmose III's own reign was ending, and he needed to establish his son's succession, Hatshepsut's successful reign as a female pharaoh was a problem. It created a precedent that threatened the traditional male succession. If a woman could be pharaoh, what did that mean for the divine right of male rulers? The solution was to erase the precedent, to pretend Hatshepsut had never ruled, to skip directly from Thutmose II to Thutmose III in the official king lists, as if those 22 years had never happened. The erasure was remarkably effective. For 3,000 years, Hatshepsut was nearly forgotten. When European scholars began studying Egyptian history in the 19th century, they knew something was strange about the inscriptions and monuments from this period, but they didn't understand what they were seeing. It wasn't until the early 20th century, when archaeologists began systematically studying the erased inscriptions and defaced monuments, that they realized what had happened. According to Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, whose early 20th century work helped reconstruct Hatshepsut's reign, piecing together her story was like solving a 3,000-year-old mystery with clues deliberately hidden and evidence intentionally destroyed. Think about that level of historical manipulation. Imagine being so successful, so competent, so undeniably powerful, that the only way to maintain the ideology of male supremacy was to pretend you never existed. Hatshepsut's erasure wasn't about her failures, it was about her success. She was erased precisely because she proved that a woman could rule as effectively as any man, and that proof had to be destroyed to maintain the system. Now let me tell you about Wu Zetian, and her story reveals another method of historical erasure, not physical destruction of monuments, but literary assassination through biased historical writing. Wu Zetian lived in Tang Dynasty China from 624 to 705 CE, and she remains the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. not as empress consort or regent, but as the sole sovereign with the title of Huangdi Emperor, according to research by Professor N. Harry Rothschild from the University of North Florida, whose work on Wu Zetian examines both her reign and her historical representation. Wu Zetian's actual accomplishments were substantial. She expanded the civil service examination system to recruit talented officials, regardless of aristocratic background. She promoted capable generals who expanded Chinese territory. She patronized Buddhism and sponsored the creation of important religious texts. And she maintained relative peace and prosperity during her 15-year reign as emperor from 690 to 705 CE. But here is what happened to her legacy. The official histories of China, written by Confucian male scholars who believed that a woman ruling as emperor was an abomination against natural order, systematically vilified Wu Zetian. They portrayed her as cruel, sexually depraved, murderous, and incompetent. According to Professor Rothschild, many of the most scandalous stories about Wu Zetian, stories that have shaped her reputation for over 1,000 years, were inventions or exaggerations created by hostile historians decades or centuries after her death. She was accused of murdering her own infant daughter to frame a rival, though there is no contemporary evidence for this claim and substantial reason to believe it was fabricated. She was portrayed as sexually insatiable and manipulative, using her feminine wiles to control men, a classic trope used to delegitimize powerful women throughout history. The historical erasure of Wu Zetian was particularly insidious because it couldn't rely on physical destruction of monuments. She had built too many, and they were too important. Instead, it relied on character assassinations so thorough that for over 1,000 years, Wu Zetian's name became synonymous with everything Chinese culture feared about women in power: ambition, ruthlessness, sexual impropriety, and disruption of natural order. According to Professor Brett Hinch from Foguang University in Taiwan, whose research on gender in Chinese history examines how female rulers were portrayed, Wu Zetian became a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when women are allowed power, used to justify excluding women from political authority for centuries afterward. What is particularly heartbreaking is that Wu Zetian's actual policies, her actual accomplishments, were largely beneficial to the empire. She promoted education and merit over aristocratic privilege. She was a patron of the arts and Buddhism. She maintained the empire's borders and prosperity. But none of this mattered to the historians who wrote about her, because to them, the very fact that she was a woman ruling as emperor was enough to condemn her regardless of her actual performance. The erasure wasn't physical, but ideological, transforming a successful ruler into a monster in collective memory. Now, let me tell you about Empress Matilda, and her story reveals yet another method of erasure, simply removing someone from the official list of rulers, as if they never reigned at all. Matilda was the daughter of King Henry I of England, his only legitimate surviving child, and she was designated as his heir. According to research by Professor Marjorie Chibnall from the University of Cambridge, whose biography of Matilda documents her life and struggle for the throne, Henry I spent years securing oaths from his barons that they would support Matilda's succession. When Henry I died in 1135, Matilda was the legitimate heir to the English throne by every contemporary standard of inheritance law, and her father's explicit designation. But here is what happened. Matilda's cousin Stephen rushed to England, seized the treasury, got himself crowned, and claimed the throne. What followed was a civil war that lasted from 1135 to 1153, nearly 20 years of conflict known as the Anarchy. Matilda invaded England in 1139 with an army, and for a period in 1141, she actually controlled London and was recognised as Lady of the English, the female equivalent of king. She was on the verge of being crowned when a combination of her own political missteps and Stephen's supporters' resistance forced her to flee London. According to historian David Crouch from the University of Hull, whose work on the anarchy examines the military and political campaigns, Matilda came remarkably close to securing the throne she was legally entitled to, and she never gave up her claim, even after the immediate prospect of coronation was lost. The Civil War ended with a compromise. Stephen would reign for his lifetime, but Matilda's son Henry would succeed him, which he did, becoming Henry II. This means that Matilda ultimately won the dynastic struggle. Her line inherited the throne, and she was the link between the Norman kings and the Plantagenet dynasty. But here is the erasure. The official list of English monarchs goes directly from Henry I to Stephen to Henry II, with no mention of Matilda. She is not counted as a queen regnant despite her legitimate claim, despite her father's designation, despite the years she fought for her throne, despite controlling parts of England and being recognised as Lady of the English. According to Professor Lois Honeycutt from the University of Missouri, whose research on medieval queenship examines Matilda's historical treatment, this erasure reflects a deliberate decision by medieval chroniclers and later historians that a woman who fought for her throne but wasn't crowned, Ned, couldn't be considered a legitimate ruler, even though male claimants who similarly fought and controlled territory without formal coronation were included in king lists. Think about that historical sleight of hand. Matilda is erased from the official record, not because she wasn't the legitimate heir, everyone agreed she was, but because she failed to overcome the opposition to a female ruler. Her erasure became retroactive justification for that opposition. If she is not in the list of monarchs, then obviously women can't rule, and therefore the barons who opposed her were right to do so. It is circular logic that erases a woman's legitimate claim, and then uses that erasure as evidence that women can't claim such positions. Let me tell you about Queen Nefertiti, and her story reveals another pattern, the mysterious disappearance from historical records that suggests deliberate erasure. Nefertiti was the great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE, and according to research by Dr. Joyce Tildersley from the University of Manchester, whose work on Amarna period queens documents Nefertiti's prominent role, Nefertiti was unusually powerful for a queen consort. She appears in reliefs and inscriptions more frequently than any previous queen, often depicted as equal to her husband, wearing the crown of a pharaoh, performing rituals typically reserved for the king, and even shown smiting enemies, a traditional pharaonic image that had never before been used for a queen. Some scholars, including Professor Nicholas Reeves from the University of Arizona, whose research on Amarna period royal tombs has sparked controversial theories, believe that Nefertiti may have ruled as pharaoh in her own right after Akhenaten's death, possibly under the name Neferneferuaten, or even co-ruling with Akhenaten during his later years. The evidence is fragmentary and hotly debated, but what is clear is that at some point during or after Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti vanishes from the historical record. Her name stops appearing in inscriptions. Her tomb, if it exists, has never been definitively found. Her fate is unknown. Here is what is particularly suspicious. The entire Amarna period, when Akhenaten and Nefertiti ruled and attempted to reform Egyptian religion toward monotheism, was subject to systematic erasure after Akhenaten's death. The pharaohs who came after, particularly Horemheb, ordered the destruction of Amarna period monuments, the erasure of Akhenaten's and his successors' names from king lists, and the return to traditional Egyptian polytheism. According to Professor Barry Kemp from the University of Cambridge, whose decades of excavation at Amarna have revealed the extent of the deliberate destruction, the erasure of the Amarna period was one of ancient Egypt's most thorough campaigns of damnatio memoriae. The deliberate erasure of memory as punishment or political necessity. Nefertiti, as Akhenaten's powerful queen and possibly a co-ruler or successor, was caught in this erasure. Whether she actually ruled as pharaoh or not, her prominent role during the Amarna period made her a target for those who wanted to erase that entire chapter of Egyptian history. The result is that one of ancient Egypt's most famous queens, whose beautiful bust in Berlin is one of the most iconic images of the ancient world, is actually a historical mystery whose life story has huge gaps and whose fate is unknown. quite possibly because deliberate historical erasure destroyed the evidence. Now, let me tell you about Boudica, Queen of the Iceni, and her story reveals how historical erasure works through distortion and romanticization that obscures the real woman and her actual accomplishments. Boudica led a massive revolt against Roman occupation of Britain in 60 to 61 CE. According to research by Professor Miranda Aldhouse, Green from Cardiff University, whose work on Boudica examines both historical sources and archaeological evidence, Boudica's revolt was one of the most serious challenges Roman authority faced in Britain, nearly driving the Romans out of the province entirely. Her forces destroyed 3 Roman towns, including Londinium, killed tens of thousands of Romans and their allies, and caused such devastation that the Roman historian Tacitus described it as a catastrophe that nearly led to Rome abandoning Britain altogether. But here is how Boudica was erased and distorted. The 2 main Roman sources about her revolt, Tacitus and Cassius Dio, writing decades and centuries after the events, portrayed Boudica in ways that both exaggerated her barbarity and undermined her legitimacy as a military leader. Tacitus, whose father-in-law fought against Boudica, portrayed her as a savage, barbarous queen whose forces committed atrocities against Roman civilians. Cassius Dio, writing 150 years after the revolt, invented lurid details about Boudica's appearance and speeches that probably had no basis in reality, but served to make her seem exotic, frightening, and ultimately inferior to Roman civilization. According to Professor Aldhouse Green, what we don't get from these Roman sources is any real understanding of why Boudica revolted, what her actual grievances were beyond Tacitus's brief. Mention that she was flogged and her daughters raped, what her leadership and strategy actually looked like, or how her own people viewed her. The Roman sources can't acknowledge that Boudica might have been a legitimate leader with just cause for rebellion, because that would undermine Roman imperial ideology. So instead, she becomes a savage barbarian queen, terrifying but ultimately doomed. More myth than historical person. The later erasure of Boudica came through Victorian romanticization. In the 19th century, Boudica was rediscovered and transformed into a symbol of British resistance and imperial glory, ironically the very things she was fighting against. According to historian Richard Hingley from Durham University, whose research on the use of Boudica in British cultural identity examines this transformation, the Victorians turned Boudica into a proto-British nationalist heroine, erasing her actual Celtic identity, her legitimate grievances against Roman imperialism, and her ultimate failure. The real Boudica, whoever she was, is lost beneath layers of Roman propaganda and Victorian myth, making another form of historical erasure that obscures a real woman's life and accomplishments. Let me tell you about Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, and her story shows how erasure can work through deliberate marginalization in historical narratives. Zenobia ruled Palmyra, a wealthy trading city in Syria, from approximately 267 to 272 CE. After her husband's assassination, she became regent for her young son, but quickly moved beyond that role to become the effective ruler of a kingdom that, at its height, controlled much of the Eastern Roman Empire's territory, including Egypt, Syria, and parts of Anatolia. According to research by Professor Nathaniel Andrade from University at Buffalo, whose work on Palmyra documents Zenobia's reign, Zenobia presented herself as a Roman-style emperor, minting coins with her image, claiming the title Augusta, and positioning herself as a legitimate inheritor of Cleopatra's legacy as an Eastern Mediterranean queen. Rome, under Emperor Aurelian, could not accept a breakaway Eastern kingdom ruled by a woman. Aurelian launched a campaign against Palmyra, defeated Zenobia's forces, captured Zenobia herself, and destroyed Palmyra so thoroughly that it never recovered as a major city. According to the limited Roman sources, primarily the Historia Augusta written decades later, Zenobia was taken to Rome and paraded through the streets in Aurelian's triumph. bound in golden chains. What happened to her after that is uncertain, with contradictory accounts suggesting either that she died shortly after or that she was pensioned off to a villa in Italy. The erasure of Zenobia came through the Roman imperial narrative that portrayed her as a rebellious client who overstepped her bounds, an oriental queen whose ambitions were unseemly for a woman, and whose defeat was therefore both necessary and inevitable. According to Professor Richard Stoneman from the University of Exeter, whose research on the Zenobia legend examines how she was portrayed in later literature, Zenobia became a romantic figure in medieval and Renaissance literature, but always as an exotic Eastern queen defined by her beauty and her eventual defeat by Rome, not as a serious political and military leader who nearly carved out an independent kingdom from Roman territory. The real scope of her accomplishments, her political acumen, and her challenge to Roman authority were minimized in favor of a narrative that made her defeat seem natural and her ambitions seem foolish. Now let me tell you about the patterns and methods of historical erasure, because understanding how this was done helps us recognize it when we see it and resist it when it happens today. According to research by Professor Sarah B. Pomeroy from Hunter College, whose work on women in the ancient world examines patterns of historical representation, the erasure of powerful women from history follows several consistent methods across different cultures and time periods. Physical erasure, like what happened to Hatshepsut, involves the literal destruction or defacement of monuments, inscriptions, and art. Literary erasure, like what happened to Wu Zetian, involves hostile or dismissive treatment in written histories that distorts the woman's character and minimizes her accomplishments. Omission, like what happened to Empress Matilda, involves simply leaving women out of official records and lists despite their legitimate claims to power. And mythologization, like what happened to Boudica and Zenobia, involves transforming real women into legendary figures whose actual historical reality is obscured. What is particularly insidious about these methods is that they're mutually reinforcing. Physical erasure makes it harder for later historians to recover the truth, because the primary evidence has been destroyed. Literary erasure shapes how people understand the woman's legacy, making her seem unworthy of remembrance. Omission from official lists creates the impression that the woman never legitimately held power, and mythologization replaces the real woman with a fictional version that serves whatever purposes later generations want her to serve. According to Professor Mary Beard from the University of Cambridge, whose work on women and power examines historical patterns of silencing women, these methods of erasure reflect deep anxieties about female power that persist across cultures and centuries. Let me tell you about more women who were erased, or nearly erased, from history, because the examples we've discussed so far are just the beginning. Queen Tai, wife of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, the mother of Akhenaten in ancient Egypt, was one of the most powerful queens in Egyptian history, but her prominence was largely forgotten until modern archaeology rediscovered her. According to Dr. Joan Fletcher from the University of York, whose research on Taï documents her exceptional power, Taï appeared alongside her husband in official art more frequently than any previous queen, was mentioned in diplomatic correspondence from foreign rulers, and may have continued to wield significant influence during her son Akhenaten's reign. But because she was associated with the Amarna period that was later erased, Taï's prominence was largely forgotten. Samaramat, known in Greek sources as Semiramis, was a queen of the Neo-Assyrian Empire who ruled as regent for her young son in the early 9th century BCE. According to Assyrian inscriptions, she was powerful enough to lead military campaigns and to have a stele erected in her honor, extremely unusual for a woman in Assyrian society. But later, Greek and Roman writers transformed Samaramat into the legendary Semiramis, a mythical queen associated with Babylon rather than Assyria, whose story became so filled with fantastical elements, founding cities, building hanging gardens, that the real woman and her actual accomplishments were completely obscured. According to Professor Stephanie Daly from the University of Oxford, whose research on Assyrian queens examines Samuramat's historical reality, we're only now beginning to recover who the real Samuramat was beneath the layers of legend. Kutulun was a Mongolian princess and warrior, the niece of Kublai Khan, who lived in the late 13th century. According to contemporary sources, particularly the account by Marco Polo who actually met her, Kutulun was an extraordinary warrior who fought alongside her father in numerous campaigns, and who declared that she would only marry a man who could defeat her in wrestling. A challenge that none succeeded in meeting despite many attempts and substantial prizes offered. Her father wanted to make her his heir over her brothers because of her exceptional capabilities. But Kutulun's story was largely forgotten or dismissed as legendary until recent scholarship, particularly work by Professor Maurice Rosabi from Columbia University, has examined the Mongolian sources and confirmed that she was a real historical figure whose military and political significance was minimized in later histories. The Trung sisters, Trung Trak and Trung Ni, led a rebellion against Chinese rule in Vietnam in 40 CE, briefly establishing an independent Vietnamese kingdom and ruling as queens for 3 years before being defeated by Chinese forces. According to Vietnamese historical sources, the Trung sisters are national heroes who fought against Chinese oppression, but Chinese historical sources either minimize their revolt or portray them as rebels against legitimate Chinese authority, an example of how the same women can be erased in one historical tradition while being celebrated in another. Professor Keith Taylor from Cornell University, whose research on early Vietnamese history examines the Trung sisters' rebellion, notes that recovering their actual history requires sifting through layers of nationalist mythology from both Vietnamese and Chinese perspectives. Let me tell you about how modern archaeology and scholarship are recovering these erased women, because this is where the story becomes hopeful. The rediscovery of Hatshepsut in the early 20th century came through painstaking archaeological work, carefully studying the erased inscriptions and defaced monuments, reconstructing her name from the fragments that remained. According to Dr. Catherine Roerig, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's 2005 exhibition on Hatshepsut brought together artifacts and scholarship that finally gave the world a comprehensive picture of Egypt's female pharaoh, 3,000 years after attempts to erase her had begun. The reassessment of Wu Zetian has come through modern scholars examining the original sources with a critical eye, questioning the bias of Confucian historians, and looking at the actual evidence of her reign's policies and accomplishments, rather than accepting the character assassination at face value. According to Professor N. Harry Rothschild, recent scholarship has revealed Wu Zetian as a far more complex and successful ruler than her traditional reputation suggested. A woman who faced enormous obstacles and overcame them through intelligence, political skill, and determination. The recovery of Empress Matilda's story has come through medieval historians, re-examining the sources, and recognizing that her erasure from monarch lists reflected political ideology rather than historical reality. According to Professor Marjorie Chibnall, Matilda's biography reveals a woman who came remarkably close to being England's first queen regnant, whose failure was due not to her own inadequacies, but to the resistance of barons who could not accept a female ruler, and whose erasure from history was a political decision, not a reflection of her legitimacy or accomplishments. These recoveries matter because they restore real women to their rightful place in history, but also because they reveal the mechanisms of historical erasure, making us more aware of how power operates through controlling historical memory. According to Professor Gerda Lerner from the University of Wisconsin, whose pioneering work on women's history examined the systematic exclusion of women from historical narratives, the recovery of women's history is not just about adding names to lists, but about fundamentally rethinking how we understand power, legitimacy, and historical significance. What really gets to me about these stories of erasure and recovery is the sheer amount of effort it took to erase these women in the first place. Think about the resources required to chisel Hatshepsut's name from every monument she built. Think about the centuries of historians who maintained the fiction that Wu Zetian was a monster. Think about the deliberate decision to exclude Matilda from monarch lists despite her legitimate claim. This wasn't passive forgetting. This was active erasure, sustained effort over years or centuries to make sure these women wouldn't be remembered. That tells us something important. These women were powerful enough, successful enough, threatening enough to the existing order that enormous efforts were made to erase them. The erasure itself is evidence of their significance. Now, let me tell you about how these patterns of historical erasure continue today, because this isn't just ancient history. According to research by Professor Bonnie G. Smith from Rutgers University, whose work on the gender of history examines how women have been excluded from historical narratives, even into the modern era, the systematic marginalization of women's contributions to history continues in textbooks, curricula, and popular understanding of the past. Women's accomplishments are minimized, attributed to men, or simply left out. Women who don't conform to acceptable feminine roles are criticized or dismissed, and women who achieve power or prominence face character assassination and delegitimization in ways that men in similar positions don't experience. Think about how many history textbooks present great men narratives that barely mention women except as wives, mothers, or victims. Think about how women scientists, artists, writers, and leaders have had their work credited to male colleagues or mentors. Think about how powerful women in contemporary politics face disproportionate criticism focused on their appearance, personality, or private lives, rather than their actual policies and accomplishments. According to Professor Melissa Estes-Blair from Auburn University, whose research on teaching women's history examines educational practices, the patterns of erasure we see in ancient history are replicated in how history is taught today, with women's contributions systematically minimized or excluded. The good news is that we're increasingly aware of these patterns and actively working to counter them. Women's history as an academic field has worked to recover forgotten women and to challenge historical narratives that exclude or minimize women's contributions. According to Professor Nancy Hewitt from Rutgers University, whose work on women's history examines the development of the field, the last 50 years have seen enormous progress in understanding women's historical experiences and contributions. Progress that has fundamentally changed how we understand the past. But the work is far from done. For every Hatshepsut who has been rediscovered and restored to her rightful place in history, there are probably dozens of other women whose names are lost forever, whose accomplishments will never be recovered, whose erasure was so complete that we don't even know they existed. According to Professor Gerda Lerner, the women we've recovered are probably the exceptional cases, women whose power was so great that some evidence survived, despite attempts at erasure. The ordinary women, the women who made smaller but still significant contributions, the women whose lives and work were important, but not on a scale that left massive monuments or multiple historical sources, those women are largely lost to us. Think about all the women through history who were teachers, healers, artists, craftspeople, community leaders, whose contributions shaped their communities, but who were never mentioned in official records because women's work was considered unimportant or because women weren't considered worthy of historical commemoration. Think about all the women whose intellectual contributions were attributed to male relatives or colleagues. Think about all the women whose political influence was exercised behind the scenes because they weren't allowed official positions of power and whose influence was therefore invisible to historians who only looked at official roles. According to Professor Judith Bennett from the University of Southern California, whose work on women's history examines the challenges of recovering ordinary women's lives, the vast majority of women's historical experiences are lost to us not through deliberate erasure, but through systematic neglect, the assumption that women's lives weren't worth recording. Let me tell you about the Candaces of Kush, warrior queens who ruled one of Africa's most powerful kingdoms, and whose stories were nearly lost because they didn't fit Western narratives about African civilization. The Kingdom of Kush, located in what is now Sudan, was ruled by a series of queens known as Candaces or Candates from approximately the 2nd century BCE to the 4th century CE. According to research by Professor Solange Ashby from UCLA, whose work on Kushite royal women documents their power and military leadership, these queens were not consorts or regents but sovereign rulers in their own right, who led armies into battle, commissioned massive building projects, and maintained diplomatic relations with Rome as equals. One Candace, Amanirenas, fought a war against Roman expansion in the 1st century BCE and negotiated a favourable peace treaty that maintained Kush's independence. She appears in Roman sources, but her accomplishments were downplayed and her authority questioned because Roman writers couldn't accept that an African woman could be a legitimate military and political leader. The erasure of the Candaces came through multiple mechanisms. Classical sources mentioned them, but portrayed them as exotic curiosities rather than serious rulers, emphasizing their supposedly unusual physical appearance and downplaying their political and military achievements. Medieval and early modern European scholars, when they encountered references to the Candaces at all, often dismissed them as mythical or confused them with the biblical Ethiopian queen. According to Professor Liz Zedteng from ETVS Lardane University, whose research on the Kingdom of Kush documents the systematic marginalization of Kushite history, European scholarship for centuries refused to acknowledge that sub-Saharan Africa had produced sophisticated kingdoms with powerful female rulers, because this contradicted racist assumptions about African inferiority and the supposed absence of African history. The Candaces were erased, not just as individuals, but as part of a broader erasure of African civilization and achievement. It is only in recent decades, with the growth of African archaeology and the decolonization of historical scholarship, that the Candaces are being restored to their rightful place as some of history's most remarkable warrior queens. Now, let me tell you about Queen Zinga of Ndongo and Matemba, who ruled in what is now Angola in the 17th century, and whose story reveals how colonial powers attempted to erase African leaders who resisted European conquest. Nzinga ruled from 1624 to 1663, nearly 40 years during which she fought a guerrilla war against Portuguese colonization, formed strategic alliances with the Dutch and neighbouring African kingdoms, and maintained her kingdom's independence through military skill, diplomatic cunning, and sheer determination. According to research by Professor Linda Haywood from Boston University, whose biography of Nzinga draws on extensive Portuguese, Dutch, and African sources, Nzinga was a brilliant military strategist who personally led troops into battle well into her 60s, a skilled diplomat who played European powers against each other, and a sophisticated political leader who transformed her kingdom's social and military structures to resist Portuguese aggression. But here is how Portuguese sources attempted to erase or delegitimize Nzinga. Contemporary Portuguese accounts portrayed her as cruel, savage, sexually deviant, and even cannibalistic, accusations that had no factual basis but served to justify Portuguese attempts to conquer her kingdoms. They questioned her legitimacy as a ruler, claiming she had usurped power even though she had a clear claim to the throne. They portrayed her military resistance as barbaric rebellion rather than legitimate defence of her sovereignty. According to Professor John Thornton from Boston University, whose research on West Central African history examines Portuguese colonial narratives, these portrayals were deliberate propaganda designed to delegitimize African resistance and justify European conquest. For centuries, Minga appeared in Western sources primarily as a curiosity or a monster, her actual accomplishments ignored or minimized. It is only through recent scholarship, particularly by African and African diaspora historians, that Nzinga's true story is being recovered, and she is being recognized as one of Africa's greatest leaders and one of history's most formidable opponents of colonialism. Let me tell you about Razia Sultana, who ruled the Delhi Sultanate in northern India from 1236 to 1240, and whose erasure reveals how gender ideology can override actual historical achievements. Razia was designated as heir by her father, Sultan Iltutmish, who explicitly chose her over her brothers because he believed she was the most capable of his children. According to research by Professor Sunil Kumar from the University of Delhi, whose work on the early Delhi Sultanate examines Razia's reign, she was an effective ruler who personally led military campaigns, held public court, and administered justice. Capabilities that her father had recognized and that she demonstrated during her 4 years as Sultan. She refused to observe purdah, the seclusion of women, appearing in public in male attire, and governing as a sultan rather than accepting any diminished female title. But Razia's gender was used against her by nobles who resented being ruled by a woman. According to contemporary chronicler Minhaj-i-Siraj, these nobles explicitly stated that they could not accept a woman as their ruler, regardless of her capabilities. They rebelled, and Razia was eventually defeated and killed in 1240. Her erasure came through how later historians treated her. Medieval and early modern Muslim historians acknowledged her existence, but portrayed her reign as an anomaly, a mistake, a violation of proper Islamic governance that naturally led to chaos and her overthrow. Her capabilities were grudgingly admitted, but always with the caveat that her being a woman made her rule illegitimate. According to Professor Iqtidar Alam Khan from Aligarh Muslim University, whose research on medieval Indian women's power examines Razia's historical treatment, she was used for centuries as a cautionary tale about what happens when women step outside their proper roles. Her failure presented as inevitable because of her gender rather than because of the specific political opposition she faced. The real Razia, a capable ruler who faced opposition not because of incompetence, but because powerful men refused to accept female authority, was buried under centuries of gendered interpretation. Now let me tell you about Queen Amina of Zazzau, who ruled in what is now northern Nigeria in the 16th century, and whose story was nearly lost because it was preserved primarily in oral tradition rather than written records. According to Hausa oral traditions, Amina was a warrior queen who expanded her kingdom through military conquest, built fortified walls around cities that are still called Amina's walls today, and ruled for over 30 years. The traditions describe her as refusing marriage to maintain her independence, personally leading cavalry charges, and transforming Zazzau into a major power that controlled trade routes across the Sahel. But because these stories were preserved orally rather than in written form, and because European scholars for centuries dismissed oral tradition as unreliable or mythical, Amina's historicity was questioned or denied. According to research by Professor UNESCO from Ahmadu Bello University, whose work on Hausa history examines the evidence for Amina's reign, there is archaeological and circumstantial evidence supporting the oral traditions, including the defensive walls and trade patterns that match what the traditions describe. But the systematic devaluation of African oral tradition as a historical source meant that Amina was relegated to the status of legend rather than accepted as a historical figure, a form of epistemological erasure that questioned not just her specific accomplishments, but the validity of African historical knowledge itself. Let me tell you about how language and translation can be tools of erasure, because this reveals another mechanism through which women's power has been hidden. In many ancient languages, there were no or limited words for female rulers, so women who held power were described using male titles or awkward circumlocutions that obscured their authority. According to research by Professor Christopher Ralston from George Washington University, whose work on ancient inscriptions examines gendered language, when ancient texts were translated into modern languages, translators often made choices that further obscured women's power. A woman described with a masculine royal title might be translated as queen consort rather than king or ruler, even when the original text used the same title for her. as for male sovereigns. Women described as leading military campaigns might be translated as accompanying armies rather than commanding them. These translation choices, often unconscious reflections of translators' assumptions about gender roles, had the cumulative effect of making women's power seem less than it actually was. One striking example comes from ancient Egypt. The word pharaoh in Egyptian is grammatically masculine, and there is no standard feminine form, so when women like Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh, they used the masculine title and masculine grammatical forms to describe their rule. When these texts are translated into English, translators face a choice: translate literally and call Hatshepsut king, which is historically accurate but feels wrong to English speakers who associate king with men, or translate as queen, which matches English gender conventions but obscures the fact that Hatshepsut held the exact same office as male pharaohs, not some separate female version. According to Dr. Kara Cooney, many early translations chose queen, which had the effect of making Hatshepsut seem like a consort or a lesser ruler, contributing to her erasure from the pharaonic succession. Similar translation issues affect how we understand powerful women from many ancient cultures, with language choices subtly diminishing their authority and accomplishments. Now let me tell you about how modern technology is helping to recover erased women, bringing hope to this story of systematic forgetting. DNA analysis has revolutionized our understanding of ancient burials, revealing that some of the most elaborate warrior burials, previously assumed to contain men, actually contain women. According to research by Professor Christine Lee from California State University, Los Angeles, whose work on ancient DNA and gender examines these discoveries, dozens of supposed male warriors have been revealed to be female through DNA analysis, forcing archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about women's roles in ancient warfare. One famous example is the Burka warrior, a high-status Viking burial from Sweden that was assumed for over a century to be male because it contained weapons and strategic gaming pieces. DNA analysis in 2017 revealed the burial contained a woman, sparking intense debate about female Viking warriors. According to Professor Neil Price from Uppsala University, who led the research team, this discovery demonstrates how gender assumptions can lead to systematic misidentification and erasure of women's military roles. Digital, reconstruction, and imaging technology is revealing women whose images were deliberately destroyed. According to Dr. Colleen Darnell from the University of Hartford, whose work uses digital imaging to study Egyptian monuments, modern technology can detect traces of erased inscriptions and defaced reliefs that are invisible to the naked eye, allowing scholars to reconstruct what was deliberately destroyed. This technology has revealed the full extent of Hatshepsut's building programs and the systematic nature of her erasure, bringing back to visibility a woman who was meant to be forgotten. Similar techniques are being applied to monuments from other cultures, revealing erased names and defaced images of powerful women across the ancient world. Let me tell you about contemporary examples of erasure attempts, because understanding that this is ongoing helps us recognize and resist it. In the 20th century, when women finally began to achieve positions of power in significant numbers, new forms of erasure emerged. According to research by Professor Jill Lepore from Harvard University, whose work on American women's history examines modern erasure patterns, women's contributions to politics, science, business, and culture have been systematically minimized or attributed to men even in the modern era when we supposedly value women's achievements. Rosalind Franklin's crucial contribution to discovering DNA structure was attributed to Watson and Crick. Countless women in early computing, despite doing the actual programming work, were erased from the history of computer science, which was rewritten as a story of male genius, political wives, and advisors whose influence shaped policy were dismissed as mere helpmates, while their husbands took credit for ideas and strategies the women developed. The erasure methods are more subtle now, but still effective. According to Professor Sarah Banate-Weiser from the London School of Economics, whose research on popular feminism examines contemporary gender dynamics. Modern erasure often works through what she calls visibility as trap, where women are hypervisible as symbols or tokens, but their actual work and accomplishments are rendered invisible. A woman leader's appearance, clothing, family status and personality receive intense scrutiny, while her policies and achievements are barely discussed. Women scientists are celebrated as diversity hires rather than for their scientific contributions. Women artists are grouped into women's art categories, separate from the mainstream, making their work seem specialized or niche rather than universal. Think about how many times you've heard a powerful woman described primarily in terms of her relationship to men, as someone's wife or daughter, or in terms of her appearance, her likability, her emotional demeanor, rather than her actual accomplishments. Think about how women leaders are held to different standards than men, criticized for being too aggressive or too weak, too ambitious or not ambitious enough in ways that make it impossible to succeed. According to research by Professor Jennifer Lawless from the University of Virginia, whose work on women in politics documents the barriers they face, this double bind serves a similar function to historical erasure. It makes women's power seem illegitimate or exceptional rather than normal, and it discourages other women from seeking power. Let me tell you about the role of memory as resistance, because this is ultimately what all these recovery efforts are about. When scholars painstakingly reconstruct Hatshepsut's cartouches from fragments, when they critically re-examine the biased sources about Wu Zetian, when they argue for Empress Matilda's place in the list of English monarchs, they're not just correcting historical errors, they're engaging in an act of resistance against the erasure, refusing to let these women be forgotten, insisting that their stories matter and deserve to be told. According to Professor Michelle Rolfe-Truilot from Johns Hopkins University, whose work on historical silences examines how power operates through controlling narratives, the recovery of silenced voices is inherently political, challenging the power structures that benefited from the silence. Every time we tell the story of an erased queen, we're asserting that women's power matters, that women's stories deserve to be remembered, that attempts to erase women from history will ultimately fail. We're connecting across millennia with women who refused to accept the limitations their societies placed on them, who seized power despite knowing they might face erasure, who believed their work was important enough to be worth the cost. And we're sending a message to women today that their work, their achievements, their power matter and will be remembered, that the erasure tactics that worked for millennia are becoming less effective as we grow more aware of them and more committed to resistance. According to Professor Gerda Lerner, women's history is not just about the past but about the future, about creating a usable past that women can draw on, a lineage of powerful women that counters the narrative of inevitable male dominance. When a young woman today learns about Hatshepsut ruling Egypt for 22 years, about Wu Zetian becoming Emperor of China, about Zinga fighting the Portuguese for 4 decades, about the Candaces leading Kushite armies, she learns that women have always wielded power, that female leadership is not new or strange or unnatural, but has existed throughout history, and that the attempts to make her believe otherwise are the real historical anomaly. Let me tell you about Lady Six Sky, a Maya queen who ruled the city of Naranjo in what is now Guatemala from 682 to 741 CE, and whose story reveals how the erasure of indigenous American civilizations extended to erasing their powerful women. Lady Six Sky, whose Maya name was Wake Shanilla Jaw, came to power when Naranjo was weak and subject to its more powerful neighbour Calakmul. According to research by Professor Simon Martin from the University of Pennsylvania Museum, whose work on Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions documents Lady Six Sky's reign, she ruled for nearly 60 years, one of the longest reigns in Maya history, during which she revitalized Naranjo's military and political power, commissioned extensive building projects, and celebrated military victories in monumental inscriptions. The hieroglyphic texts describe her performing royal rituals, overseeing construction, and celebrating the capture of enemy lords, all activities that demonstrate her active rule. But here is how Lady Six Sky and countless other powerful Maya women were erased. When Spanish conquistadors and later colonial administrators encountered Maya civilization, they interpreted it through their own patriarchal assumptions, assuming that all rulers were male and that women could only have been consorts or regents, never rulers in their own right. Colonial period documents systematically misgendered Maya rulers or ignored evidence of female power. According to Professor Rosemary Joyce from the University of California, Berkeley, whose research on gender in Mesoamerican archaeology examines colonial misrepresentation, Spanish sources created a narrative of Maya civilization that erased women's political and religious authority, a narrative that persisted in archaeological and historical interpretation well into the 20th century. It was only when scholars learned to read Maya hieroglyphics in the late 20th century and began to question their gender assumptions that powerful Maya queens like Lady Six Sky began to be recognized for what they actually were: sovereign rulers who wielded political, military, and religious authority. The broader erasure of pre-Columbian American civilizations meant that powerful indigenous women were doubly erased, first by colonial narratives that refused to acknowledge their authority, and second by the general Western tendency to minimize or ignore indigenous American history and civilization. According to Professor Patricia McCannany from the University of North Carolina, whose work on Maya society documents the recovery of women's roles, we're only beginning to understand the extent of women's power in pre-Columbian American societies, and every new translation of ancient texts or reinterpretation of archaeological evidence reveals more women whose authority was hidden by centuries of colonial and post-colonial misrepresentation. Now, let me tell you about Queen Liliuokalani, the last sovereign monarch of the Hawaiian kingdom, and whose story reveals how erasure continues into the modern era through colonialism and imperialism. Liliuokalani ruled Hawaii from 1891 to 1893, and according to research by Professor Noeno Silva from the University of Hawaii, whose work on Hawaiian sovereignty documents Liliuokalani's reign and resistance. She was a sophisticated political leader who tried to strengthen Hawaiian sovereignty against increasing American economic and political pressure. She proposed a new constitution that would restore voting rights to native Hawaiians and Asians, who had been disenfranchised by an earlier constitution forced on her brother by American business interests. In response, American businessmen, supported by US Marines, overthrew her in 1893, imprisoned her in her own palace, and eventually annexed Hawaii to the United States. The erasure of Liliuokalani and Hawaiian sovereignty came through several mechanisms. American sources portrayed the overthrow as a legitimate political transition, erasing the violence and illegality of the coup. They portrayed Liliuokalani as a primitive, incompetent ruler whose overthrow was necessary for progress and civilization. Racist narratives that justified colonization. They erased or minimized the sophisticated political and legal arguments that Liliuokalani and other Hawaiian leaders made against annexation. For over a century, American textbooks either didn't mention the overthrow of Hawaii's government or portrayed it as a willing merger, erasing the resistance and the injustice. According to Professor Silva, it is only in recent decades, through the work of native Hawaiian scholars and the sovereignty movement, that the truth about Liliuokalani's overthrow and the illegal annexation of Hawaii has begun to be widely recognized and taught. Liliuokalani spent her later years writing music and her memoir, deliberately creating records that couldn't be as easily erased, acts of resistance against the forces trying to make Hawaiian sovereignty disappear from history. Let me tell you about Queen Nanny of the Maroons, who led a community of escaped enslaved people in Jamaica in the early 18th century, and whose story reveals how the erasure of black women's resistance has been systematic and deliberate. According to Jamaican oral traditions and limited contemporary records, Queen Nanny was a military and spiritual leader who established a free community in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, successfully resisted British attempts to recapture or destroy the Maroon communities for decades, and is credited with freeing over 800 enslaved people. She was a brilliant guerrilla warfare tactician, using the mountainous terrain to her advantage and developing strategies that frustrated British military forces. According to research by Professor Carla Gottlieb from the University of the West Indies, whose work on Maroon history examines Queen Nanny's leadership, she was both a political and spiritual leader, practicing obeah and serving as the community's connection to African religious and cultural traditions. But Queen Nanny's erasure came through multiple mechanisms. British colonial records, when they mentioned Maroon leaders at all, almost always focused on male leaders, erasing or minimizing women's leadership roles. The few mentions of Queen Nanny in colonial sources portrayed her as a witch or savage, using racist and sexist tropes to delegitimize her. When the British finally negotiated a treaty with the Maroons in 1740, recognizing their freedom and autonomy, the treaty was signed by male Maroon leaders, and Queen Nanny's role in achieving this victory was erased from the official record. According to Professor Gottlieb, Queen Nanny's memory was preserved primarily through oral tradition in Maroon communities, and it is only in recent decades that academic historians have begun to seriously research and document her life and leadership, recognizing her as one of Jamaica's national heroes and a symbol of resistance to enslavement and colonialism. What strikes me most powerfully about all these stories is the pattern of who gets erased and why. It is not random, it is not accidental. The women who are most thoroughly erased were those who most directly challenged the systems of power that benefited from their erasure. Hatshepsut challenged the idea that only men could be pharaohs, so her nephew erased her to restore that ideology. Wu Zetian challenged the Confucian order that excluded women from imperial power, so Confucian historians destroyed her reputation. The Candaces challenged Greek and Roman assumptions about African civilization and female leadership, so classical sources minimized them. Nzinga challenged Portuguese colonialism, so Portuguese sources demonized her. Queen Nanny challenged slavery and white supremacy, so colonial records erased her. The pattern is clear. Women who wielded power in ways that threatened patriarchy, racism, colonialism, or class hierarchies were systematically erased, and the erasure served to reinforce those same oppressive systems by making it seem as if women had never successfully challenged them. According to Professor Kimberly Crenshaw from UCLA, whose work on intersectionality examines how multiple forms of oppression interact, women who faced multiple forms of marginalization, women of color, colonized women, enslaved women, were often most thoroughly erased because they challenged multiple systems of power simultaneously. A woman like Queen Nanny threatened both white supremacy and patriarchy, so her erasure served multiple ideological purposes. A woman like Lilu Okalani challenged both imperialism and gender hierarchies, so American sources had multiple reasons to minimize and distort her story. Understanding this pattern of intersectional erasure is crucial for understanding why some women's stories are harder to recover than others, and why the recovery of those stories is so threatening to existing power structures. Let me tell you about what we lose when women are erased from history, because it is not just about individual stories, important as those are. We lose understanding of the full range of human political and social organization. When powerful women are erased, it becomes easier to claim that male dominance is natural, universal, and inevitable, rather than being a historically specific set of arrangements that vary across cultures and can be changed. We lose role models and precedents for contemporary women seeking power. When women are told that female leadership is unprecedented or unnatural, it is harder for them to envision themselves as leaders. We lose important historical knowledge about how societies actually functioned when women's political and economic contributions are erased. our understanding of historical events becomes distorted and incomplete. According to Professor Joan Wallach-Scott from the Institute for Advanced Study, whose work on gender and history examines the politics of historical knowledge, the erasure of women from history is not just about the past, but about the present and future. Historical narratives shape what we think is possible, what we think is natural, what we think is desirable. When history is written as if men were the only important actors, it becomes easier to justify continued male dominance in the present. When we recover women's history, we're not just correcting the record, we're expanding the realm of possibility, showing that arrangements we're told are natural and inevitable are actually contingent and changeable. Think about the young girls growing up today who are learning about Hatshepsut, Wuzetian, the Candaces, Nzinga, Razia Sultana, Lady Six Sky, Queen Nanny, Luluakalani, and all the other powerful women we've met tonight. They're learning that women have always been leaders, warriors, rulers, rebels, and resistors. They're learning that when people try to tell them that women can't do something or shouldn't do something, they can point to historical examples of women who did exactly that thing, often brilliantly. They're learning to question the stories they're told about what is natural or inevitable. That is why the recovery of these erased women matters so much. And that is why the work of the scholars who are doing this recovery is so important and so inherently political. Let me tell you about the future of this work, because we're living in a remarkable moment for the recovery of erased women. New technologies like DNA analysis, digital imaging, and computational text analysis are revealing women who were hidden for centuries. New theoretical frameworks like intersectionality and post-colonial theory are giving scholars tools to understand and analyze patterns of erasure. New social movements demanding diversity and inclusion are creating pressure to recover and teach women's history. According to Professor Marsha Wright from Columbia University, whose work on African women's history has helped establish the field, we're seeing an explosion of scholarship on women's history across all world regions and time periods, scholarship that is fundamentally changing our understanding of the human past. But we're also seeing resistance to this recovery work. According to Professor Stephanie Kuntz from Evergreen State College, whose work on the history of the family examines contemporary debates about gender, there is significant pushback against teaching women's history, against acknowledging the realities of historical oppression, against centering previously marginalized voices. This resistance often comes from the same impulse that led to erasure in the first place: the desire to maintain existing power structures by controlling historical narratives. When people argue against teaching about historical racism or sexism, when they claim that recovering marginalized voices is divisive or political, they're essentially arguing for continued erasure, for maintaining the incomplete and distorted narratives that serve existing hierarchies. The struggle over historical memory is ongoing, and the stakes are high. Every time a textbook is written that centers great men and marginalizes women, that is a contemporary act of erasure. Every time a museum chooses what stories to tell and whose artifacts to display, that is a choice about memory and forgetting. Every time we decide what historical events to commemorate and whose statues to erect, we're engaged in the politics of historical memory. According to Professor James Lowen, whose work on how American history has taught documents the systematic distortions and omissions in textbooks, the history we teach shapes the citizens we create and the futures we can imagine. If we teach history as if only certain people mattered, as if only certain forms of power and achievement counted, we're limiting what future generations will think is possible for themselves. As we come to the end of tonight's journey into historical erasure and recovery, I want you to think about what these stories mean for us today. The women we've met tonight, Hatshepsut, Wuzetian, Empress, Matilda, Nefertiti, Boudica, Zenobia, the Candaces, Nzinga, Razia Sultana, Amina, the Trung sisters, Lady Six Sky, Luluakalani, Queen Nanny, and all the others were real people who lived, ruled, fought, and accomplished extraordinary things. They weren't perfect, no ruler is, They made mistakes, faced limitations, and sometimes failed in their ambitions, but they were powerful, capable, significant historical figures whose erasure from history was not about their inadequacies, but about the threat they posed to patriarchal systems that couldn't accept women in positions of ultimate power. Their stories remind us that historical narratives are constructed, that what we remember and what we forget are the results of choices, often political choices about whose stories matter and whose can be erased. They remind us to question the narratives we're given, to ask whose perspectives are missing, to wonder about the women who aren't in our history books and why they're not there. And they remind us that erasure is never complete, that evidence survives, that dedicated scholars can recover lost stories, and that the women who were deemed too threatening to remember can be brought back into our collective memory. Let me tell you about Rani Abaka Chowta, who ruled Ulal in coastal India from approximately 1525 to 1570, and whose story reveals how colonial powers attempted to erase indigenous resistance to European expansion. Abaka was a queen of the Chowta dynasty who fought Portuguese attempts to colonize her territory for over 4 decades. According to research by Professor Bhavike Rai from Mangalore University, whose work on the Tuluva Queens documents Abaka's military campaigns, she defeated Portuguese forces in multiple naval and land battles, formed strategic alliances with neighbouring kingdoms and the Zamarin of Calicut, and maintained her kingdom's independence despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned by Portuguese colonial forces. She personally led troops into battle, used guerrilla tactics effectively, and was so formidable that Portuguese records referred to her as the Pepper Queen and acknowledged her as one of their most dangerous adversaries. But here is how Abaka was erased. Portuguese colonial records, while acknowledging her military prowess out of necessity, portrayed her as a savage, treacherous enemy of civilization and Christianity. They minimized her strategic brilliance and portrayed her victories as flukes or attributed them to the men around her. Indian historical narratives, dominated by North Indian and Mughal-focused histories, largely ignored South Indian regional rulers, including Abaka. According to Professor Razi, it is only in recent decades that Abaka has been recovered as a significant historical figure, recognized as one of the earliest and most successful resistors of European colonialism in India. Her erasure served both colonial interests by minimizing indigenous resistance and patriarchal interests by denying that a woman could be a successful military leader. Now let me tell you about Tamar of Georgia, who ruled the Kingdom of Georgia from 1184 to 1213, and whose story reveals how even successful women rulers can be subtly diminished through how they're remembered. Tamar presided over what is considered the Georgian Golden Age, a period of military expansion, cultural flourishing, and economic prosperity. According to research by Professor Donald Rayfield from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on Georgian history documents Tamar's reign, she successfully defended Georgia against Muslim powers, including the Seljuk Turks and the Khwarezmian Empire, expanded Georgian territory significantly, patronized arts and literature, and was an astute political leader who navigated complex regional politics brilliantly. Her reign was so successful that she was canonized as a saint by the Georgian Orthodox Church. But here is the subtle erasure. Tamar is remembered in Georgia, but her story is almost unknown outside the Caucasus region. When Western historians write about medieval power or military leadership, they rarely include Tamar, even though her accomplishments rival those of contemporary male rulers, who are well known. According to Professor Stephen Rapp from Georgia State University, whose research on medieval Caucasian history examines gender and power, Tamar's relative obscurity in Western historical consciousness reflects a broader pattern of marginalizing non-Western and female rulers. Even in Georgian memory, there is a tendency to emphasize her piety and beauty over her political and military acumen, a subtle form of feminization that diminishes her actual accomplishments. The real Tamar, a shrewd political operator and successful military leader, gets obscured by narratives that make her seem more like a benevolent saint than the tough, capable ruler she actually was. Let me tell you about Ya Asantewaa, who led the Ashanti Empire's war against British colonisation in what is now Ghana in 1900, and whose story reveals both erasure and recovery in African history. Ya Asantewaa was the Queen Mother of Ijisu in the Ashanti Empire, and when the British demanded the surrender of the Golden Stool, the sacred symbol of Ashanti sovereignty, and when male leaders hesitated to resist, Ya Asantewaa delivered a famous speech challenging the men to fight and declaring that if they would not, the women would, according to research by Professor A. Aduboahen from the University of Ghana, whose work on colonial resistance documents the War of the Golden Stool. Ya Asantewaa then led Ashanti forces in a war against the British that lasted from March to September 1900, during which Ashanti forces besieged British troops in their fort at Kumasi for months. Though the war ultimately ended in British victory and Ya Asantewaa's capture and exile, the resistance was significant enough that the British never obtained the Golden Stool and had to recognise limits to their control. The initial erasure of Ya Asantewaa came through British colonial narratives that either ignored her leadership or portrayed the war as a minor uprising rather than a serious challenge to colonial authority. Her gender was used to delegitimise the resistance, with British sources suggesting that being led by a woman indicated the Ashanti's desperation or irrationality. According to Professor Ivor Wilkes from Northwestern University, whose research on Ashanti history examines oral and written sources, Ya Asantewaa's story was preserved in Ashanti oral tradition, and post-independence Ghanaian historians worked to recover and celebrate her as a national hero. Today, she is recognised in Ghana as a symbol of resistance to colonialism and female leadership, but her story remains less known internationally than it deserves to be. Her recovery demonstrates both the importance of oral tradition in preserving erased histories and the power of post-colonial scholarship to challenge colonial narratives. Now let me tell you about Olga of Kiev, who ruled Kievan Russes from 945 to 960 CE, and whose story reveals how the conversion to Christianity could both preserve and distort women's power. Olga came to power as regent for her young son after her husband was murdered by the Drevlians, a neighbouring people. According to the primary chronicle, the main historical source for early Kievan Russes, Olga took brutal revenge on the Drevlians, personally orchestrating their destruction through cunning and deception. She then ruled Kievan Russes for approximately 15 years, during which she reformed the tax system, built fortifications, and established diplomatic relations with the Byzantine Empire. She converted to Christianity and worked to spread the faith in her realm, for which she was later canonized as a saint by both the Orthodox and Catholic churches. But here is how Olga's story has been filtered through Christian hagiography. The primary chronicle, written by Christian monks centuries after her death, portrays her revenge on the Drevlians as justified and clever, but her political and administrative accomplishments get less attention than her religious conversion. According to Professor Janet Martin from the University of Miami, whose work on medieval Russes examines gender and power, later Christian sources increasingly emphasized Olga's piety and downplayed her political shrewdness and, frankly, her violence. She became remembered primarily as Saint Olga the Wise rather than as the formidable political and military leader she actually was. Her canonization ensured she wasn't completely erased like many other powerful women, but it also transformed her into a more acceptable, feminized figure, a pious Christian rather than a ruthless ruler. The real Olga, who burned an entire city and buried envoys alive, gets softened in religious memory. Let me tell you about Nur Jahan, who effectively ruled the Mughal Empire alongside and sometimes in place of her husband Emperor Jahangir from 1611 to 1627. And whose story reveals how women's power exercised behind the scenes gets erased even when it was actually quite public. Nur Jahan was the wife of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, but according to research by Professor Ruby Lal from Emory University, whose biography of Nur Jahan examines her political power, she wielded extraordinary authority. Coins were minted in her name, an unprecedented honour for a Mughal woman. She issued royal orders, met with ambassadors, made administrative decisions, and effectively governed the empire during periods when Jahangir was incapacitated by illness or opium addiction. She was a skilled hunter, an accomplished poet, a patron of architecture and arts, and a shrewd political operator. But Nur Jahan's erasure came through how Mughal history was later written and understood. According to Professor Ellison Banks Findley from Trinity College, whose research on Mughal women examines their political roles, later Mughal historians, and especially British colonial historians, portrayed Nur Jahan as manipulative and scheming, a woman who improperly influenced her weak husband rather than a legitimate political leader in her own right. Her power was delegitimized by being characterized as influence rather than authority, as manipulation rather than governance. The narrative framework refused to acknowledge that she actually ruled, instead portraying her as a wife who exceeded her proper role. This framing served to erase her actual political accomplishments by recharacterizing them as inappropriate female meddling. Modern scholarship is recovering the reality of Nur Jahan's power, but the dominant narrative about her for centuries minimized and delegitimized what was actually quite open and acknowledged female rule. Let me tell you about how the concept of separate spheres, the ideology that divided life into male public political sphere and female domestic sphere, functioned as a tool of erasure, even for women who didn't live within that framework. According to research by Professor Linda Kerber from the University of Iowa, whose work on separate spheres ideology examines its historical development and impact, this concept emerged primarily in Western Europe and America in the 18th and 19th centuries, but it was then retroactively applied to interpret all of history. Historians read ancient and medieval sources through the lens of separate spheres, assuming that women must have been confined to domestic roles, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Women who clearly wielded political power were reinterpreted as exceptions, anomalies, or as women who improperly stepped outside their natural sphere. This ideology created a form of conceptual erasure that made it difficult to even see women's power when it was documented. A woman who governed was reinterpreted as a woman who influenced her husband or son who really governed. A woman who led armies was reinterpreted as a figurehead or symbol, while men actually commanded. A woman who made political decisions was reinterpreted as a wife offering domestic advice that happened to have political consequences. According to Professor Kerber, separate spheres ideology was never an accurate description of how most women actually lived, even in the 19th century when it was most prominent, but it became a powerful interpretive lens that distorted understanding of women's historical roles. Breaking free of this framework has been crucial for recovering women's political history, requiring historians to take seriously the evidence that women held and exercised political power, rather than assuming they must have been confined to domestic roles. Now let me tell you about the power of naming and how what we call things shapes whether they're remembered. Throughout this journey tonight, I've used the word queen for many of these women, but that word itself can be a form of erasure. In English, queen can mean either a female monarch who rules in her own right, or the wife of a king who holds no political power herself. This linguistic ambiguity means that when we say queen, listeners might assume consort rather than ruler, diminishing the woman's actual authority. According to research by Professor Judith Bennett from the University of Southern California, whose work on medieval women examines the problems of historical terminology, many powerful women have been erased simply through imprecise language that doesn't distinguish between women who held power and women who were married to power. Hatshepsut wasn't a queen in the sense of consort. She was pharaoh, holding the same office as male rulers. Wu Zetian wasn't an empress consort. She was emperor, the sovereign ruler. Razia Sultana wasn't a sultan's wife. She was sultan. Using the same word for female rulers as for consorts collapses the distinction and makes it harder to recognize women's actual political authority. Some languages have or had distinct words for ruling women versus consorts, but English conflates them. According to Professor Bennett, this linguistic erasure is subtle but powerful, shaping how we think about and remember women's power. When we have to add qualifiers like queen regnant, or ruling queen, or empress in her own right, the extra explanation needed already suggests that female rule is exceptional or unusual, while male rule is assumed as the default. Let me tell you about the erasure of women's intellectual and creative work, because the pattern extends beyond political power. Throughout history, women's writings, inventions, discoveries, and artistic creations have been attributed to men, dismissed as collaborative efforts, where the man was primary or simply lost because no one thought women's work was worth preserving. According to research by Professor Margaret Rossiter from Cornell University, whose work on women in science documents systematic patterns of erasure and credit theft, the phenomenon she calls the Matilda effect, named after suffragist Matilda Joslyn Gage, who first identified it, describes the systematic under-recognition of women scientists whose work is attributed to male colleagues. Rosalind Franklin's contribution to discovering DNA structure, attributed to Watson and Crick. Lise Meitner's contribution to discovering nuclear fission, attributed to Otto Hahn. Jocelyn Bell Burnell's discovery of pulsars, for which her male advisor won the Nobel Prize while she was excluded. This pattern extends back through history. Women's medical knowledge was often characterized as folk remedies or witchcraft, while men's identical knowledge was called medicine. Women's writing was published under male pseudonyms or attributed to male editors. Women's inventions were patented in their husbands' or fathers' names because women couldn't hold patents in their own right. According to Professor Rossiter, this erasure wasn't just about individual women being denied credit, though that was unjust enough. It created a false historical narrative where men appeared to be the sole creators and discoverers, making women's intellectual contributions seem rare or impossible, which in turn justified excluding women from educational and professional opportunities. The erasure became self-perpetuating. Women were said to be incapable of intellectual work because there were no famous female intellectuals. But there were no famous female intellectuals because women's intellectual work was systematically erased. Now let me tell you about the particular ways that women of colour have been erased from feminist history itself. A meta-erasure that reveals how power operates even within movements for justice. According to research by Professor Kimberl Crenshaw, whose work on intersectionality has transformed how we understand overlapping oppressions, early feminist movements in the United States and Europe were often dominated by white middle-class women who centered their own experiences and marginalized women of color. The history of women's suffrage, for example, is often told as if it was primarily about white women's struggle for voting rights, erasing the fact that African American women, Latina women, Asian American women, and indigenous women fought for suffrage while also fighting against racism, often in separate movements because white suffragists excluded them or refused to address racial justice. Sojourner Truth's famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech challenged white feminists to recognize black women's experiences, but even that speech has been erased and distorted, with the most commonly circulated version being a later rewriting in Southern dialect. That Truth, who grew up in New York speaking Dutch and English, never actually used. According to Professor Nell Irvin Painter from Princeton University, whose biography of Sojourner Truth documents the historical truth versus the mythologized version, this distortion served to make Truth seem more exotic and less intellectual, diminishing her actual radical critique of both racism and sexism. Ida B. Wells, who led anti-lynching campaigns and fought for women's suffrage while white suffragists tried to distance themselves from racial justice. Mary Church Terrell, who founded the National Association of Coloured Women and fought for both women's rights and civil rights. These women, and countless others, were often erased from mainstream feminist history or tokenized as exceptional individuals, rather than recognized as part of broader movements of women of color organizing for justice. Let me tell you about how visual representation has been a tool of both erasure and resistance. When we think about what powerful historical women looked like, we're often relying on images created by people who had an interest in portraying them certain ways. Cleopatra, one of the few ancient female rulers who hasn't been completely erased, has been portrayed in Western art and film as a great beauty whose power came from seduction rather than her actual political and intellectual capabilities. According to research by Professor Mary Hammer from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on Cleopatra examines her representation across history, the real Cleopatra was multilingual, highly educated, a skilled diplomat and administrator, but Western portrayals consistently reduce her to a beautiful seductress. The visual representations, from Renaissance paintings to Hollywood films, erase her actual sources of power and replace them with feminine wiles and sexual allure. For women who were deliberately erased, we often have no visual representation at all. Hatshepsut's statues were destroyed, so we can only imagine what she looked like from the few fragments that survived. Many powerful women have no surviving portraits or sculptures, because creating such images was considered inappropriate for women, or because the images were deliberately destroyed. According to Professor Diane Apostolos Capodona from Georgetown University, whose work on visual culture examines gender and representation, the absence of visual images of powerful women contributes to their erasure from popular consciousness. People struggle to imagine what they can't see, and the lack of familiar visual representations of female rulers makes it harder for people to conceptualize women in power. Modern artists creating images of these erased women are engaging in an act of resistance, giving visual form to women who were meant to be forgotten and helping contemporary viewers connect with them. Think about the portraits you see in museums and history books, in currency and monuments. How many women do you see? How many of those women are portrayed as rulers, leaders, intellectuals, rather than as beautiful objects, mothers, or religious figures? According to research by the National Museum of Women in the Arts, which tracks gender representation in major museums, women artists are significantly underrepresented in museum collections and exhibitions, and portraits of powerful women are rarer still. This visual erasure in public spaces sends a message about who matters, whose stories are worth commemorating, whose faces we should recognize and remember. Every statue of a male general or king, unmarked by gender, because male is assumed as default, represents a choice not to memorialize a woman. Every currency note bearing a male leader's image represents a choice not to honor a female leader. Let me tell you about how the recovery of erased women's stories is happening in unexpected places and ways. Genealogists researching family histories are uncovering women whose accomplishments were minimized or attributed to male relatives. Digital humanities projects are using computational text analysis to track how frequently women are mentioned in historical texts and how they're characterized. Museum curators are re-examining collections with attention to gender, discovering that objects attributed to anonymous or to male artists were actually created by women. Archaeologists using new scientific techniques are identifying the sex of skeletal remains more accurately, revealing that some burials previously assumed to be male warriors or leaders actually contain women. According to Professor Sarah Bond from the University of Iowa, whose work on digital approaches to ancient history examines these new methodologies, technology is providing tools for recovery that previous generations of historians didn't have, making it possible to find evidence of women who left few textual traces. Oral history projects are recording stories of women whose contributions to recent history risk being forgotten. Community historians are preserving local women's history that academic historians might overlook. Activists are demanding that streets, buildings, and monuments be named for women as well as men, creating public memory where erasure had existed. According to Professor Emily S. Rosenberg from the University of California, Irvine, whose work on public history examines how historical memory is constructed and contested, these efforts to recover and commemorate women's history are inherently political, challenging the default assumption that history is about great men and insisting that women's stories matter and deserve public recognition. What I find most hopeful about this moment is the growing awareness of erasure patterns and the commitment to resistance. When a museum opens an exhibition on women's history, when a textbook includes chapters on women's experiences, when a filmmaker tells the story of a forgotten queen, when a scholar publishes a biography of an erased woman, they're not just educating people about the past. They're actively resisting ongoing erasure, insisting that these women's stories matter, creating resources for future generations to learn about women's history. Every act of recovery is also an act of resistance, a refusal to accept the narrative that women haven't been important historical actors. Let me tell you about Tomyris, queen of the Massagean Central Asia in the 6th century BCE, and whose story reveals how ancient women's military victories were preserved, but distorted. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Tomyris ruled the Massachetae, a nomadic people in what is now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and she defeated and killed Cyrus the Great of Persia, one of antiquity's most successful military leaders, when he invaded her territory around 530 BCE. The story goes that after Cyrus killed Tomyris' son through treachery, she challenged Cyrus to battle, defeated his army, and had Cyrus beheaded, placing his head in a windskin full of blood as revenge. This is one of history's most dramatic military victories by a female leader over a male conqueror. But here is how Tomyris has been erased and distorted. According to research by Professor Adrian Mayer from Stanford University, whose work on women warriors in antiquity examines archaeological and textual evidence, Tomyris' story was recorded by Herodotus and other ancient historians, but later scholars questioned whether she was real or merely legendary. The very fact that a woman defeated one of history's great conquerors made the story seem implausible to historians, who couldn't imagine women as successful military leaders. Some scholars suggested that Tomyris was a mythical figure, that the story was invented to explain Cyrus's death, or that if she existed, she must have been merely a figurehead while men actually commanded. According to Professor Mayer, archaeological evidence of women warriors in Central Asian nomadic cultures actually supports the historicity of women like Tomyris leading armies. But the gender assumptions of later historians led to centuries of dismissing or minimizing her story. Now let me tell you about Artemisia I of Caria, who commanded ships in the Persian fleet during Xerxes' invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, and whose story reveals how even when women's military leadership was acknowledged, it was framed as exceptional and unnatural. Artemisia ruled Halicarnassus and commanded 5 ships in the Battle of Salamis. According to Herodotus, Xerxes valued her advice above that of his male commanders, and when she distinguished herself in battle, he supposedly said, "My men have become women, and my women men," acknowledging her courage, while simultaneously using her as an insult to his male commanders. She survived the battle and continued ruling her state successfully. The erasure of Artemisia came through how her story was framed in ancient sources and how it has been interpreted since. According to research by Professor Elaine Fantham from Princeton University, whose work on ancient women examines their representation in classical sources, Artemisia was portrayed as exceptional, a woman who acted like a man, which simultaneously acknowledged her capabilities and used her to reinforce gender norms by suggesting that powerful women were anomalies who had to become masculine to succeed. This framing erased the possibility that women could be effective leaders while remaining women, that female leadership was a legitimate category, rather than women temporarily adopting male characteristics. The narrative made Artemisia's success about her exceptional masculinity, rather than about women's capability for political and military leadership. And despite being mentioned in ancient sources, Artemisia remains largely unknown today, overshadowed by male leaders from the same period, whose accomplishments were often less remarkable than hers. Let me tell you about Trithedaught Trint, known as Lady Tritheu, who led a rebellion against Chinese rule in Vietnam in 248 CE, and whose story has been preserved in Vietnamese tradition, but distorted through layers of legend and male-centered historical writing. According to Vietnamese sources, Lady Tritheu raised an army and led it in battles against the Chinese, riding a war elephant and inspiring her troops with the declaration, "I want to ride the tempest, tame the waves, kill the sharks. I want to drive the enemy away to save our people. I will not resign myself to the usual lot of women who bow their heads and become concubines." She fought for months before being defeated and, according to tradition, committed suicide rather than be captured. But Lady Tritheu's erasure came through several mechanisms, according to research by Professor Keith Taylor from Cornell University, whose work on Vietnamese history examines how Vietnamese heroes are remembered. Chinese historical sources either didn't mention her rebellion at all or minimized it as a minor disturbance. Vietnamese sources preserved her memory, but increasingly added legendary elements, having her grow to enormous size in battle or attributing supernatural powers to her, which had the effect of making her seem mythical rather than historical. The focus on her beauty and her tragic death, the romanticization of her resistance, often obscured the actual political and military dimensions of her rebellion. According to Professor Taylor, recovering the historical Lady Tritheu beneath the layers of legend and romanticism is difficult, but what is clear is that she was a real woman who led real resistance to Chinese occupation, whose story deserves to be known as widely as those of male resistance, leaders from the same period. Now let me tell you about how the definition of power itself has been a tool of erasure. When we think about powerful women in history, we often think about queens and empresses, women who held formal political office. But this narrow definition of power erases countless women who wielded enormous influence and authority through other channels. According to research by Professor Bonnie Smith from Rutgers University, whose work on women's history examines the politics of historical knowledge, limiting our understanding of power to formal political office is itself a gendered choice that privileges the kinds of power men typically held and erases the kinds of power women often wielded. Women religious leaders who commanded the loyalty of thousands, who shaped theological debates, who built institutions that lasted centuries, exercised real power, but are often excluded from histories of powerful women because religious authority isn't counted as political power. Women who controlled wealth through inheritance, business or marriage, and used that wealth to shape politics, patronize arts, fund military campaigns, or influence rulers, exercised economic power that translated into political influence, but they're often invisible in political histories. Women who shaped culture through their salons, their writings, their artistic patronage. Their roles as cultural arbiters exercised cultural power that influenced how people thought and what was valued. But cultural influence isn't counted as real power in traditional political history. According to Professor Gerda Lerner, one form of women's erasure has been the refusal to recognize as power the forms of authority and influence that women actually held. By defining power narrowly as formal political office and military command, areas where women were most systematically excluded, historians created a framework where women's power was almost definitionally invisible, expanding our understanding of what counts as power, recognizing economic, cultural, religious, and informal political influence as real forms of authority, reveals a much richer history of women's agency and impact. But it also requires challenging the assumption that only certain kinds of power matter or deserve historical attention. Let me tell you about how motherhood and family relationships have been used both to erase women's power and to preserve it in distorted forms throughout history. Powerful women have often been described primarily in terms of their relationships to men, as the wife of X or the mother of Y, even when they held power in their own right. According to research by Professor Joe Bermargadont from Santa Clara University, whose work on queenship examines how female rulers were represented, this relational labeling had the effect of making women's power seem derivative, as if they held authority only through their connections to men rather than in their own right. But there is a complicated dynamic here. Sometimes being remembered as mother or wife was the only way women's stories were preserved at all. Some powerful women who might have been completely erased from male-authored chronicles survived in historical memory, precisely because their roles as mothers of famous sons or wives of famous kings made them impossible to completely ignore. According to Professor Margadant, this created a distorted preservation where women's actual accomplishments were minimized or erased, but their existence was remembered through their familial roles. The recovery work then involves acknowledging that yes, she was the mother of a famous king, but she was also a ruler in her own right, a political operator, a patron of arts, a military leader, roles that were erased when she was reduced to queen mother or royal consort. Think about how many powerful women you know primarily as the wife of or the mother of famous men. Eleanor of Aquitaine is often introduced as the wife of 2 kings and mother of 2 more, which is true but also obscures the fact that she was a powerful ruler in her own right, controlled vast territories, went on crusade, sponsored arts and literature, and shaped European politics for decades. Catherine de' Medici is often remembered primarily as the mother of 3 French kings, which is true but erases her 40 years of political power as queen mother and regent. This framing isn't entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that diminish women's actual authority and agency. Now let me tell you about the erasure of women's networks and collective action, because one of the most effective ways to erase women's power has been to individualize and isolate powerful women. According to research by Professor Bonnie Anderson from Brooklyn College, whose work on women's political activism examines transnational networks, powerful women throughout history rarely operated alone. They formed networks with other women, created alliances, supported each other's political goals, and engaged in collective action. But historical narratives tend to present powerful women as isolated individuals, exceptional anomalies, making it seem as if each powerful woman was unique and alone rather than part of broader patterns of women's authority and resistance. Medieval queens formed networks across European courts, maintaining correspondence, arranging marriages, coordinating policies, and supporting each other against their husbands' and sons' advisors. Women religious leaders created networks of convents and monasteries that functioned as centers of education, healthcare, and economic production. Women writers and artists supported and promoted each other's work. Women abolitionists, suffragists, labor organizers, and civil rights activists built movements through networks and collective organizing. But when we focus on individual great women, we lose sight of these networks and make it seem as if women's power was exceptional and individual rather than collective and systemic. According to Professor Anderson, erasing women's networks serves to make women's power seem anomalous and unrepeatable. If we see powerful women as isolated individuals who succeeded through exceptional personal qualities, it is easier to dismiss their significance and harder to imagine women collectively organizing for power. But when we recover women's networks and recognize that powerful women were often connected to and supported by other women, it reveals patterns of women's collective action and mutual support that challenge narratives of inevitable male dominance. Let me tell you about how the concept of respectability has functioned as both a tool of control and a source of erasure for women who didn't conform. Throughout history, women who wielded power often had their morality and sexual behavior scrutinized and attacked in ways that men in similar positions didn't experience. According to research by Professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham from Harvard University, whose work on African American women's history examines the politics of respectability, the demand that women be respectable, meaning conforming to narrow standards of feminine behavior, sexual propriety, and domestic focus, has been used to delegitimize women who sought or held power. Women rulers were accused of sexual impropriety, whether or not there was any evidence. Wu Zetian was portrayed as sexually insatiable. Cleopatra was characterized as a seductress who used sex to control powerful men. Catherine the Great of Russia was the subject of obscene rumors and pornographic pamphlets. These accusations served multiple purposes. They delegitimized these women's political authority by suggesting they gained power through sex rather than capability. They portrayed powerful women as morally corrupt and therefore unfit to rule, and they shifted attention from these women's actual political and military accomplishments to their supposed sexual behavior. But here is where the erasure comes in. Women who actually did transgress sexual norms, women who had lovers outside marriage, women who rejected marriage entirely, women whose sexuality didn't conform to heterosexual expectations, women who were sex workers or who existed outside respectable society. These women have been almost completely erased from history. According to Professor Higginbotham, the demand for respectability meant that only certain kinds of women's stories were considered worthy of preservation. Women who couldn't be portrayed as respectable, even if they wielded power or influence, or led remarkable lives, were erased or reduced to moral cautionary tales. The recovery of these unrespectable women's stories is crucial not just for historical accuracy, but for challenging the assumption that only certain kinds of women, those who conform to narrow standards of feminine propriety, deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Women don't have to be respectable to be worthy of historical attention. Women's lives and contributions matter regardless of whether they conformed to patriarchal standards of feminine behavior. Let me tell you about how colonial education systems systematically erased indigenous women's history and authority. When European powers colonized Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Oceania, they imposed educational systems that taught colonized peoples a version of history centered on European men. According to research by Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o from the University of California, Irvine, whose work on decolonizing education examines how colonial curricula shaped historical consciousness, children in colonized territories learned about European kings and queens, European military leaders, European scientists and writers, but not about their own ancestors, their own leaders, their own intellectual and cultural traditions. For indigenous women, this created a double erasure. They were erased from European history because they weren't European, and they were often erased from indigenous history as it was taught in colonial schools because those curricula, when they included indigenous history at all, focused on male leaders and warriors deemed worthy of attention. According to Professor Linda Tuhiwai-Smith from the University of Auckland, whose work on decolonizing methodologies examines how research has been complicit in colonialism, indigenous women's roles as leaders, knowledge keepers, spiritual authorities, and political actors were systematically minimized or ignored in colonial education, creating generations who grew up not knowing their own histories of women's power and authority. The decolonization of education involves recovering these erased histories, centering indigenous ways of knowing and remembering, and challenging the European-centered narratives that served colonial power. According to Professor Smith, this recovery work is inherently political, challenging both the colonial legacy that erased indigenous history and the patriarchal assumptions that erased women within indigenous history. It requires listening to oral traditions, taking seriously forms of knowledge and memory that European scholarship dismissed, and recognizing that the erasure of indigenous women's history was not accidental but served the interests of both colonial and patriarchal power. Now let me tell you about the importance of teaching this history of erasure, not just the recovered stories of individual women, but the patterns and mechanisms of how women have been systematically forgotten. According to research by Professor Joan Wallach Scott Understanding how historical erasure works is crucial for developing critical historical consciousness. The ability to question narratives, recognize whose perspectives are missing, and understand that all history is constructed through choices about what to remember and what to forget. When students learn about Hatshepsut, they should also learn about how she was erased and why, and how that erasure was eventually uncovered and challenged. When they learn about Wu Zetian, they should understand not just her reign, but how hostile historians distorted her legacy for centuries and how modern scholars are recovering her actual story. When they learn about any powerful woman from history, they should ask, how do we know about her? What sources survived? Whose perspectives are represented in those sources? What might have been erased or distorted? Who benefited from erasing or distorting her story? This kind of critical historical thinking is essential for understanding not just the past, but the present. According to Professor Scott, when students understand how historical narratives are constructed and contested, they become better equipped to critically evaluate the narratives they encounter about contemporary events, to ask whose stories are being told and whose are being silenced, to recognize how power operates through controlling knowledge and memory. The history of women's erasure becomes a lens for understanding how marginalized people's experiences and perspectives are rendered invisible in dominant narratives, and how that invisibility serves existing power structures. Let me tell you about the hope I find in the recovery work that is happening now. Every year, more forgotten women are being discovered, studied, written about, and taught. Scholars are publishing biographies of women whose names were almost lost. Museums are mounting exhibitions that center women's experiences and accomplishments. Filmmakers are telling the stories of remarkable women who deserve to be known. Teachers are incorporating women's history into their curricula. According to research by Professor Gerda Lerner, we're living through a remarkable period of expansion in women's history, with more scholarship on women's historical experiences being produced than in all previous history combined. But what gives me the most hope is not just the recovery of individual women's stories, as important as that is. What gives me hope is the growing understanding of the patterns of erasure, the mechanisms through which women's power and accomplishments have been systematically hidden and forgotten, because understanding how erasure works makes us better able to resist it, to recognize it when it is happening in our own time, to insist on remembering and honoring women whose contributions might otherwise be forgotten. Every time a young girl learns about a powerful woman from history and thinks, I could do that too, every time someone questions why they never learned about these women in school, every time a scholar uncovers another erased woman's story, every time we collectively decide to remember rather than forget, to honor rather than minimize, to celebrate rather than erase, we're participating in an ongoing struggle over historical memory that has profound implications for the present and future. Thank you for joining me on this journey tonight into the stories of forgotten queens and the patterns of historical erasure. I hope these stories have given you a new perspective on history, a deeper appreciation for the women whose power made them targets for erasure, and perhaps some thoughts about how we can resist similar patterns of erasure in our own time. As you drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to remember Hatshepsut and the monument that survived with her name on it. I want you to remember Wu Zetian and the scholars who looked past the propaganda to see her actual accomplishments. I want you to remember Empress Matilda and the historians who recognized that she belonged in the list of English monarchs, regardless of what medieval chroniclers decided. I want you to remember Nzinga fighting the Portuguese for 4 decades, the Candaces leading Kushite armies, Yaya, Asantewaya challenging British colonialism, Lilowakalani resisting through memory and music, Queen Nanny freeing the enslaved and building free communities. I want you to remember all the women whose names we've spoken tonight, and all the women whose names are lost to us, whose power and accomplishments deserved to be remembered. Tonight, as you rest in your comfortable bed, in a world where women's right to power and recognition is more accepted than ever before in history though, still far from equal, Remember that this progress came through the efforts of countless women who refused to be erased, who insisted on being heard and remembered, who fought for their legacies even when powerful forces tried to destroy them. The women we've met tonight were part of that long struggle, and so is every woman today who achieves, who leads, who refuses to be silenced or forgotten. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with a commitment to remembering, to questioning whose stories are told and whose are erased, to seeking out the forgotten voices and the marginalized perspectives, and to ensuring that the powerful women of our own time won't face the systematic erasure that the queens of history endured. Sleep well tonight, knowing that memory is a form of resistance, that storytelling is a form of power, and that every time we recover a forgotten woman's story, we strike a blow against the systems that tried to erase her. Good night, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the voices of queens who refused to be forgotten and the scholars who brought them back to life.